November 14th, 1968. Kon Tum Province, Central Highlands. Sergeant Jack Whiskey O'Malley hangs out the side of the slick Huey helicopter as the skids brush the tops of the triple canopy jungle. The wind whips through the open bay doors, carrying the heavy scent of rotting vegetation and impending rain, while the thumping rotor blades beat a rhythm against his chest. Below him lies a sea of endless green that stretches toward the Cambodian border, a deceptively peaceful blanket hiding thousands of North Vietnamese regulars moving south. His grip tightens on his Car-15 rifle as the pilot signals the drop zone is hot and the bird begins its stomach-churning descent. The helicopter hovers just feet above the tall elephant grass, kicking up a blinding storm of debris that stings exposed skin like a swarm of angry hornets. O'Malley and his team of 6 Americans and 12 Montagnard strikers leap into the swaying grass, their boots sinking deep into the mud instantly. They sprint for the tree line, lungs burning in the humid air, desperate to escape the exposed landing zone before enemy mortars can find their range. The extraction bird peels away with a deafening roar, leaving them in a sudden, suffocating silence that feels heavier than the 80-pound rucksacks strapped to their sweating backs. Moving through the Central Highlands is less like walking and more like swimming through a dark, tangled ocean of vines and wait-a-minute bushes. The air is so thick with moisture that it feels like breathing through a wet wool blanket, and sweat drenches every uniform within minutes of stepping off the bird. Every step requires a deliberate effort to avoid snapping a twig or tripping on the exposed roots that snake across the jungle floor like tripwires. The canopy above is so dense that it blots out the midday sun, creating an eternal twilight where shadows dance and play tricks on tired eyes. Captain Miller takes point, his hand signals sharp and precise, guiding the column deeper into the forbidding terrain with practiced ease. Flanking the Americans are the Montagnard Scouts, indigenous warriors who move through the undergrowth with the silent grace of jungle cats. These men are the eyes and ears of the patrol, sensing changes in the atmosphere that the Americans would miss entirely. One of them, a scarred fighter named Wybom, pauses to sniff the air and glances nervously toward the ridgeline, his instincts honed by years of hunting both animals and men in these unforgiving mountains. Their objective is a suspected way station along a branch of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where intelligence reports massive troop movements over the last week. The command in Saigon wants prisoners and documents, but O'Malley knows that out here, the mission is simply to survive the encounter. They are miles outside of artillery support range, operating in a grey zone where the borders on the map mean nothing to the enemy regiments, moving freely through the valleys. The isolation settles over the team, a tangible weight that reminds every man that if things go wrong, help is a long flight away. The equipment they carry is a testament to the specialized nature of their warfare. Stripped down for speed and silence in the bush, O'Malley adjusts the straps of his webbing, ensuring his magazines are tapped down and his grenades are taped to prevent accidental rattling. He wears tiger stripe camouflage that blends perfectly with the shadows, a stark contrast to the standard olive drab of the regular infantry. Even their faces are painted in patterns of green and black, erasing their humanity and turning them into phantom extensions of the jungle itself. O'Malley pauses to check his compass and feels the familiar, sickening pinch of a leech attaching itself to his neck above the collar. He flicks the bloated parasite away with a grimace, watching a trickle of blood mix with the grime on his skin. The jungle is alive with things that want to bite, sting, or infect, adding a layer of biological warfare to the tactical threat. Insects buzz incessantly around their heads, a maddening soundtrack that threatens to mask the snap of a bolt or the rustle of a sandal on dry leaves nearby. By late afternoon, the point man freezes and raises a clenched fist, bringing the entire column to a halt in absolute stillness. Captain Miller moves forward to inspect a faint depression in the mud that looks dangerously like a boot print rather than a bare foot or a sandal. The tread pattern is distinct, indicating the canvas jungle boots worn by North Vietnamese regulars rather than the local Viet Cong guerrillas. O'Malley feels a cold chill run down his spine despite the heat, realizing that they have stumbled upon a fresh trail used by a significant force very recently. The team moves with renewed caution now, their eyes scanning the dense foliage for the telltale glint of metal or the shape of a pith helmet. Every shadow looks like a crouching soldier, and the chatter of monkeys in the canopy sounds like mocking laughter. They are walking into the lion's den, and the feeling of being watched grows stronger with every meter they advance. Yabam whispers something to the captain in his tribal dialect, gesturing emphatically toward the high ground that looms over their path like a brooding giant waiting to strike. As the light begins to fade, turning the jungle from green to a bruised purple, Captain Miller signals for the team to establish a remain overnight position. They choose a defensive spot near a thick cluster of bamboo, forming a tight 360-degree perimeter with claymore mines set facing outward. The men work in silence, their movements mechanical and efficient as they clear fields of fire and prepare for the long darkness ahead. Digging in is impossible in the root-choked earth, so they settle for shallow scrapes and the cover of the massive tree trunks. Night falls over the Central Highlands like a heavy curtain, plunging the world into a darkness so absolute it feels suffocating. The sounds of the jungle shift from the diurnal birds to the nocturnal predators, a cacophony of chirps and rustles that masks the approach of an enemy. O'Malley stares into the black void, his pupils fully dilated, trying to distinguish between a swaying fern and a creeping sapper. He grips the detonator clacker for his claymores, his knuckles white, knowing that the most dangerous time is just beginning for the isolated patrol. The waiting is always the hardest part of the mission, a psychological torture that stretches minutes into hours. O'Malley listens to the slow, rhythmic breathing of the man next to him, taking comfort in the presence of his brother in arms. They share a silent bond forged in training and tempered in combat, a trust that requires no words to express. But even that bond feels fragile against the immense, crushing weight of the hostile wilderness surrounding them. The jungle feels like a living entity tonight, holding its breath as if anticipating the violence that is about to erupt. Radio silence is strictly enforced, with communications limited to whispered checks and the occasional squelch break on the handset. The radio operator, Specialist Turner, sits hunched over the PRC-25, the faint static, a lifeline to the outside world that feels impossibly distant. He knows that transmitting now could give away their position to enemy radio direction finders, bringing a rain of mortar fire down on their heads. They are ghosts in the machine, trying to remain invisible while occupying the same space as a hunter who knows the terrain far better than they do. Around 0200 hours, the wind shifts slightly, drifting down from the ridgeline and carrying a scent that makes the montagnards stiffen. It is faint, almost imperceptible to the American nose, but it smells of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and fish sauce. O'Malley catches a whiff of it moments later, the odor triggering a primal alarm in his brain that screams of immediate danger. He nudges the soldier beside him, Sergeant Rodriguez, who nods slowly in the darkness, his eyes wide and fixed on the wall of black vegetation in front of them. The jungle goes silent, the insect noise cutting off abruptly as if a switch has been flipped by an unseen hand. This sudden quiet is more terrifying than the noise, signaling that a predator is moving through the undergrowth nearby. O'Malley eases the safety off his rifle, the metallic click sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. He can hear the blood rushing in his ears, a pounding drumbeat that matches the racing of his heart. Something is out there, moving with purpose and coordination, tightening a noose around their small perimeter. A twig snaps distinctively to the north, followed by the soft, metallic clink of a sling swivel hitting a rifle stock. It is the sound of human error, a mistake made by a soldier moving too close to his prey. O'Malley raises his weapon, aligning the sights on the darkness where the sound originated, his finger taking up the slack on the trigger. The air is electric with anticipation, the calm before the storm shattering as a single green flare shoots up into the canopy, bathing the jungle in a ghostly comzas. Sickly light, the eerie green light of the flare hangs suspended in the canopy like a dying star, stripping away the safety of the darkness and exposing the team's position in stark, monochromatic relief. For a heartbeat, time seems to stretch into infinity, allowing O'Malley to see the silhouettes of pith helmets rising from the elephant grass less than 30 meters away. Then, the jungle explodes with a violence that defies description, shattering the humid air with the simultaneous crack of dozens of AK-47 seconds. Green tracer rounds slash through the night like angry laser beams, crisscrossing the perimeter and chewing into the tree trunks with the sound of angry woodpeckers. An RPG-7 rocket shrieks out of the undergrowth, its distinct propellant trail sizzling before it impacts the large teak tree above Captain Miller's position. The explosion showers the team with razor-sharp shrapnel and splintered wood, forcing everyone to bury their faces into the dirt to escape the deadly rain. The concussion wave punches the air from their lungs, leaving them gasping in the dust and smoke that instantly fills the small perimeter. O'Malley feels the heat of the blast wash over him, a physical blow that rattles his teeth and momentarily deafens him to everything but a high-pitched ringing. Instinct overrides panic as O'Malley jams the firing device for his claymore mines, his hand moving with the desperate speed of a man fighting for his life. He squeezes the clacker 3 times in rapid succession, sending an electrical charge down the wires to the mines planted facing the enemy rush. The resulting detonations are earth-shattering. 3 directional blasts of C4 explosive that send thousands of steel ball bearings screaming through the vegetation at supersonic speeds. The front line of the charging NVA assault force is instantly vaporized, turned into a red mist that halts the human wave in its tracks. The sudden roar of the claymores creates a momentary lull in the incoming fire, the enemy stunned by the ferocity of the American response. In that brief window of opportunity, the Green Berets and their Montagnard allies rise up to unleash their own torrent of lead. M16S and Car, 15 seconds bark in controlled bursts, sending streams of red tracers reaching out to meet the green ones, creating a deadly, weaving tapestry of light in the darkness. The noise is a physical assault, a cacophony of screams, explosions, and automatic weapons fire that drowns out all rational thought. Sergeant Rodriguez, the team's heavy weapons specialist, hauls his M60 machine gun up onto a rotting log, feeding a belt of ammunition into the hungry beast. The pig roars to life, its deep, rhythmic chugging sound distinct from the lighter crack of the assault rifles, providing a psychological anchor for the beleaguered defenders. Rodriguez sweeps the barrel back and forth, cutting down the tall grass like a scythe and suppressing the enemy muzzle flashes that sparkle in the tree line. Brass casings fly from the ejection port in a golden arc, piling up in the mud beside him as he pours fire into the shadows. Captain Miller crawls from position to position, ignoring the rounds snapping past his head like angry bees, checking on his men and directing their fire. His voice is hoarse from screaming over the din, but his tone is rock-steady, cutting through the fear that threatens to paralyze the younger strikers. He grabs a terrified Montagnard by the shoulder, shaking him back to reality and pointing out a target, forcing the man to focus on the immediate task of killing rather than dying. This is the leadership of the Special Forces, leading from the front when the world is falling apart around them. The enemy, however, is not a ragtag group of local guerrillas, but a disciplined, hardened regiment of the North Vietnamese army. Regrouping quickly from the shock of the mines, they begin to maneuver with professional precision, using whistles and bugles to coordinate their movements in the dark. They probe the perimeter for weaknesses, sending small squads to test the flanks while their heavy machine guns pin the Americans down from the front. O'Malley watches the muzzle flashes shift to the right and realizes they are trying to encircle the team, cutting off any hope of escape. Doc Henderson, the team's medic, is already at work, his hands slick with blood as he tends to a wounded striker who took a round through the shoulder. The man is thrashing in pain, his eyes wide with shock, but Doc works with a calm efficiency, slapping a pressure dressing on the wound and injecting morphine. Even in the midst of the firefight, the medic is a calm center in the storm, murmuring reassurances that go unheard over the roar of battle. He drags the wounded man deeper into the cover of the tree roots, shielding his patient with his own body as dirt kicks up around them. The smell of the battlefield is becoming overpowering, a nauseating cocktail of cordite, burning phosphorus, pine resin, and the coppery tang of fresh blood. It creates a thick, acrid smog that clings to the back of the throat and stings the eyes, making it even harder to see the enemy. O'Malley coughs as he changes magazines, his hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline dump that has flooded his system. He checks his ammunition pouches, doing a quick mental calculation of his remaining rounds, and a cold knot of dread tightens in his stomach. Specialist Turner is hunched over the radio handset, screaming into the microphone in a desperate attempt to contact the forward air controller FAC. The atmospheric conditions and the dense canopy are wreaking havoc on the signal, filling the chaotic airwaves with static and broken transmissions. He switches frequencies rapidly, his fingers flying over the dials, trying to punch a hole through the electronic wall that separates them from salvation. Finally, a crackly voice responds, faint and distant, acknowledging their troops in contact call. But the news is grim. Air support is minutes away. An eternity in a firefight. A mortar round whistles in, landing dangerously close to the center of the perimeter, shaking the ground with a dull, heavy thud that feels like a punch to the gut. Dirt and debris rain down on O'Malley, burying his legs and filling his collar with grit. The NVA have dialed in their range, and now they are beginning to walk the mortar fire across the American position with terrifying accuracy. This is the prelude to the final assault, a softening-up bombardment designed to break the defenders' will and shatter their cohesion before the infantry rushes in to finish the job. Yibam, the Montagnard leader, fights with a ferocity that borders on the suicidal, standing exposed to hurl grenades into the encroaching darkness. He screams insults at the invisible enemy in his native tongue, a warrior chant that rallies his fellow tribesmen to hold their ground. His M2 carbine spits fire, and O'Malley sees him drop an NVA soldier who had managed to crawl within 10 meters of their line. The closeness of the combat is horrifying. This is not fighting at a distance, but a visceral, intimate struggle for survival, where you can hear the enemy cursing as they die. Suddenly, the enemy fire slackens, dropping off as quickly as it had begun, leaving a ringing silence that is somehow more menacing than the noise. It is a tactical pause, a moment for the NVA commanders to assess the damage and reorganize their forces for the next push. O'Malley strains his ears, listening past the ringing tinnitus for the sound of movement, the snap of a twig, or the metallic click of a magazine being locked into place. The jungle feels like it is closing in, the darkness pressing against his eyeballs, hiding 1,000 threats in its inky depths. Captain Miller crawls over to O'Malley's position, his face smeared with camouflage paint and grime, his eyes hard and intense. He leans in close, whispering so that his voice doesn't carry to the enemy, listening just meters away in the grass. He confirms what O'Malley has already suspected. They are facing at least a battalion-sized element, possibly more. The enemy is digging in for a siege, and they are not going to let the team leave this mountain alive without a fight that will go down in history. O'Malley looks at the luminous dial of his watch and realizes with a shock that only 20 minutes have passed since the first flare went up. It feels like they have been fighting for hours, yet the night has barely begun. The exhaustion is already clawing at his limbs, the adrenaline crash leaving him feeling heavy and slow. He grips his rifle tighter, staring out into the black void, knowing that the next wave is coming, and this time the enemy won't make the same mistakes. The silence stretches, taut as a piano wire, until a single bugle note pierces the darkness, signaling the start of the second round. The solitary bugle note is answered by a shrill chorus of whistles that pierce the humid night air like the screams of frightened birds. It is a sound every veteran in Vietnam dreads, the signal for a coordinated mass assault designed to overwhelm a defensive position through sheer weight of numbers. From the darkness of the tree line, a guttural roar erupts from hundreds of throats, a terrifying war cry that drowns out the mechanical hum of the jungle insects. O'Malley feels the vibration of the approaching stampede through the soles of his boots, the ground trembling under the rhythmic pounding of countless feet charging across the killing zone. Suddenly, the darkness transforms into a chaotic sea of movement as wave after wave of North Vietnamese soldiers burst from the elephant grass. They come running low and fast, bayonets fixed on their AK-47 seconds, disregarding personal safety in a drug-fueled or politically indoctrinated frenzy to breach the American lines. Flares pop overhead, casting the attackers in a surreal, flickering light that makes them look like disjointed marionettes jerking forward in a macabre dance. O'Malley shoulders his Car-15 and holds down the trigger, spraying automatic fire into the wall of humanity, watching bodies crumple only to be instantly replaced by the men running behind them. To his right, Sergeant Rodriguez is screaming obscenities as he works the M60 machine gun, the weapon bucking violently against his shoulder with every round. The barrel is glowing a dull, cherry red in the darkness, radiating heat waves that distort the air and threaten to melt the rifling inside the steel tube. He sweeps the beaten zone back and forth. The heavy 7.62 rounds tearing through flesh and bone, cutting swathes through the attacking ranks like a scythe through wheat. Brass casings pile up around his knees, hot enough to burn skin. But Rodriguez ignores the pain, knowing that if the gun goes down, they are all dead men. Despite the withering wall of fire put up by the Green Berets and the Montagnard strikers, the enemy momentum is impossible to stop completely. The NVA soldiers scramble over the bodies of their fallen comrades, using the mounds of dead as sandbags to advance closer to the American perimeter. They hurl potato masher grenades, the wooden handles spinning through the air before landing with dull thuds inside the defensive circle. Explosions rock the ground, sending geysers of mud and shrapnel into the air, forcing the defenders to dive into their shallow scrapes and disrupting their fields of fire. A terrifying breach occurs on the southern flank where a squad of sappers, stripped down to loincloths and coated in grease to slip through wire, manage to crawl undetected to the edge of the line. They toss satchel charges into a foxhole occupied by 2 Montagnard scouts, the resulting blast vaporizing the position and opening a gaping hole in the defense. Through the smoke and confusion, NVA infantry pour into the gap like water rushing through a broken dam, screaming triumphantly as they flank the American position. The battle instantly devolves from a firefight into a desperate, hand-to-hand brawl for survival in the mud. O'Malley spins around to see an enemy soldier lunging at him from the shadows, the long spike bayonet of an SKS rifle aiming for his chest. There is no time to aim or fire. He parries the thrust with the barrel of his own weapon, the metal clanging sharply, and drives his boot into the attacker's knee. The man grunts and stumbles, giving O'Malley the split second he needs to smash the butt of his rifle into the soldier's face. The violence is primal and intimate, a frantic struggle of sweat, blood, and adrenaline where civilization is stripped away, leaving only the instinct to kill or be killed. Captain Miller realizes the outer perimeter is collapsing and that staying spread out will result in the team being sliced apart piecemeal. He grabs his radio handset, shouting over the din of battle, ordering a collapse to pull the remaining men back to the inner circle around the command post. It is a dangerous maneuver to execute under fire, requiring the men to retreat while suppressing the enemy. Trading space for time, Miller stands tall amidst the flying lead, firing his sidearm and physically grabbing soldiers, shoving them toward the center to prevent a rout. The retreat is chaotic and terrifying, a blur of motion as men scramble backward over routes and equipment, firing blindly into the encroaching darkness. Bullets zip past them from all directions now, the perimeter having dissolved into a confused melee where friend and foe are separated by mere feet. O'Malley trips over a rucksack and hits the ground hard, rolling onto his back just as a burst of green tracers chews up the earth where his head had been a second before. He scrambles to his feet, mud slicking his hands, and sprints for the large teak tree that marks the center of their position. Doc Henderson is in the thick of the retreat, half carrying, half dragging a wounded striker whose leg has been shattered by machine gun fire. The medic refuses to abandon his patient, his face set in a grim mask of determination as he navigates the hellscape of the collapsing perimeter. He pauses only to fire his M16 one-handed at a shadow rushing them, then heaves the wounded man over a fallen log, grunting with exertion. Bullets kick up dirt around his boots, but Henderson moves with a singular focus, his dedication to his oath overriding the instinct for self-preservation. The team eventually coalesces into a tight, desperate knot around the command post, forming a defensive circle no wider than 20 meters across. They are back-to-back now, facing outward into a 360-degree nightmare, their world shrunk to the distance of a grenade throw. The NVA, sensing victory, press their advantage, closing in from all sides and tightening the noose around the beleaguered survivors. The air is thick with the smell of cordite and burning flesh, a nauseating stench that sticks to the back of the throat and triggers the gag reflex. Specialist Turner is huddled over the radio, screaming into the handset, trying to make himself heard over the deafening roar of combat and the static of the jungle atmosphere. He is calling for anything that can fly: spooky gunships, phantom jets, even medical evacuation slicks, but the response is garbled and panicked. The enemy is jamming frequencies, and the intense vegetation is absorbing the signal, isolating the team in a bubble of electronic silence. He looks up at Captain Miller, his eyes wide with fear, shaking his head to indicate that for now, they are on their own. Ammunition is running critically low, and the men are forced to scavenge magazines from the wounded and the dead to keep their weapons fed. O'Malley checks his pouches and finds he is down to his last 2 magazines. A terrifying realization that makes his blood run cold. He switches his selector switch to semi-automatic to conserve rounds, taking careful aim at the muzzle flashes in the tree line rather than spraying and praying. Every shot has to count now. A missed round is a wasted opportunity to buy another few seconds of life for the team. The NVA begin to lob Chicom grenades into the tight perimeter with increasing frequency, trying to blast the Americans out of their final stronghold. The small, black explosives rain down like deadly hail, forcing the defenders to play a lethal game of hot potato. Yee-bum! The Montagnard leader scoops up a sizzling grenade that lands near Miller's feet and hurls it back into the darkness an instant before it detonates. The explosion screams through the trees, followed by the screams of the enemy soldiers who had been creeping forward for the kill, proving the NVA are right on top of them. Suddenly, O'Malley's weapon jams, the bolt grinding to a halt halfway forward on a dirty casing, rendering the rifle a useless club. Panic flares in his chest, hot and sharp, as he drops to one knee behind the cover of a root system to clear the stoppage. He frantically works the charging handle, his fingers slipping on the hot metal and the mud, while bullets impact the wood inches from his face, showering him with splinters. He curses under his breath, finally ripping the magazine out and digging the jammed round free with his fingernail, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he slams a fresh magazine home and snaps the bolt forward. He looks across the small circle and locks eyes with Captain Miller. The officer's face is bloodied from a shallow shrapnel wound to the forehead, and his expression is one of grim resignation mixed with steely resolve. Miller knows that they cannot hold this position for much longer against such overwhelming numbers. The human wave is eroding their defenses like the tide against a sandcastle. He reaches for the radio handset himself, pushing Turner aside, and keys the mic with a thumb that is steady despite the chaos. He is about to make the call that no commander ever wants to make, the call that signifies the end of all tactical options. Captain Miller presses the transmit button on the handset, his voice cutting through the static with a chilling calmness that belies the chaos erupting around him. He utters the 2 words that every American commander in Vietnam prays he never has to say, the code phrase that declares a ground unit is in imminent danger of being overrun and destroyed. Broken arrow, he says, repeating it for emphasis. I say again, broken arrow. The effect on the radio network is instantaneous and profound, freezing all other traffic across the theater as controllers clear the airwaves for the emergency. In the skies above the Central Highlands, every available aircraft is immediately diverted toward Miller's coordinates, abandoning their previous missions to save the doomed patrol. The forward air controller, flying a small O-2 Skymaster high above the cloud layer, responds with a voice that is tight with tension, verifying the coordinates one last time. He warns Miller that the enemy is dangerously close to the friendly position, inside the minimum safe distance for heavy ordnance delivery. Miller looks up at the jungle canopy, now illuminated by the muzzle flashes of 100 enemy rifles, and grimly replies that the enemy is not just close. They are practically sharing the same foxholes. He orders the air support to drop directly on his perimeter, accepting the terrifying probability of friendly casualties as the only alternative to certain massacre by the NVA. Minutes later, the deep, throaty roar of radial engines shakes the ground, a sound distinctly different from the high-pitched whine of the jets. A flight of A-1 Sky Raiders, affectionately known as Spads by the infantry, descends through the darkness like avenging angels. These propeller-driven relics from a previous war are slow, low-flying, and capable of carrying an immense payload of destruction that faster jets cannot match in this terrain. O'Malley hears them coming and screams at his men to get down, to bury themselves in the mud, to become one with the earth if they want to live through the next 60 seconds. The first Sky Raider screams in at treetop level, its engine howling as the pilot lines up on the strobing marker light thrown by the FAC. 2 silver canisters tumble from the wings, flipping end over end in a graceful, deadly arc toward the jungle floor just outside the American perimeter. They impact with a dull thud that is felt rather than heard, splitting open to release their contents an instant before the igniters spark. A wall of napalm erupts into existence, a rolling tsunami of liquid fire that consumes everything in its path with a terrifying, roaring whoosh that sucks the oxygen right out of the air. The heat is instantaneous and searing, a physical wave that washes over the defenders, singeing eyebrows and blistering exposed skin, even though they are yards away from the impact zone. The jungle, wet with rain and humidity just moments ago, is instantly transformed into a raging inferno, the vegetation crackling and popping as the jellied gasoline clings to leaves and branches. For a moment, the gunfire ceases, replaced by the horrific, unearthly screams of the North Vietnamese soldiers caught in the blaze. It is a sound of pure agony that chills O'Malley to the bone, a reminder of the terrible price of their survival. However, the NVA are veteran soldiers who understand the mechanics of American air power better than any other enemy in history. They know that the safest place to be during an airstrike is as close to the Americans as possible, a tactic they call hugging the belt. Instead of retreating from the fire, the surviving enemy infantry surge forward through the smoke and heat, diving into the bomb craters and crawling toward the green berets. They are gambling that the American pilots will not dare to drop bombs any closer, using the team's own air support as a shield to close the final distance. O'Malley lifts his head from the dirt, his eyes stinging from the acrid smoke, and sees a shadow rising from the orange glow of the fires. An NVA soldier, his uniform smoking and his face a mask of soot, charges with a bayonet, screaming a war cry that sounds more like a howl of pain. O'Malley snaps his rifle up and fires twice, the bullets knocking the man backward into the burning undergrowth. The battle has descended into a surreal nightmare where men fight like demons in a landscape that looks like the surface of hell, illuminated by the flickering light of burning napalm. Sergeant Rodriguez has abandoned his overheated machine gun and is now fighting with his people, 45 caliber pistol and a captured AK-47. He stands near the center of the perimeter, firing methodically at the shapes moving in the smoke, his face illuminated by the muzzle flashes. He spots a group of sappers trying to flank their position using the confusion of the airstrike and hurls a grenade into their path. The explosion is muffled by the roar of the fire, but the screams that follow confirm a direct hit, buying the team a few more precious seconds of breathing room. Above them, the Sky Raiders circle back for another pass, the pilots pushing their vintage aircraft to the limit to provide continuous coverage. Captain Miller is back on the radio, his voice raspy from smoke inhalation, talking the pilots onto a new target vector. He is calling the strikes in closer now, literally walking the ordnance up to the toes of his own men. The pilots hesitate, their training screaming against dropping high-drag bombs within 20 meters of friendlies, but Miller overrides them, taking full responsibility for the consequences. He knows that if the bombs don't kill them, the battalion of NVA gathering for the final push certainly will. The next run brings the high-drag snake-eye bombs, designed to deploy metal fins that slow their descent, allowing the aircraft to escape the blast radius while dropping at low altitude. The bombs detonate with earth-shattering force, the concussion waves slamming into the defenders like invisible sledgehammers. The ground heaves violently, throwing men into the air and collapsing the sides of their shallow foxholes. O'Malley is slammed against the trunk of the teak tree, his helmet striking the wood hard enough to see stars, his ears ringing with a deafness that blocks out all other sound. For a long minute, the world is nothing but dust, smoke, and the vibration of the earth settling back into place after the violence. O'Malley shakes his head to clear the cobwebs, spitting out dirt and blood, and checks his limbs to ensure they are still attached. He looks around the cratered moonscape that was once a lush jungle and sees his teammates slowly stirring. Rising from the debris like the undead, they are battered, deafened, and terrified, but they are still alive, protected by the very violence that nearly killed them. Doc Henderson is frantically checking the wounded, his hands moving quickly over their bodies to identify new injuries caused by the concussion. One of the Montagnard strikers is bleeding from the ears and nose, a sign of severe blast trauma. But he is conscious and gripping his carbine. Henderson shouts at him. But the man cannot hear. He simply nods, his eyes wide and vacant, locked in the 1,000-yard stare of a man who has seen too much. The medic pats him on the shoulder and moves to the next man, doing what he can with his dwindling supplies. The respite provided by the bombs is short-lived, as the NVA commanders rally their troops with whistles and threats, forcing them back into the attack. They know the aircraft have to leave eventually to refuel and rearm, and they are determined to finish the fight before the planes return. Bullets begin to snap through the smoke again, sounding different now as they pass through the superheated air. The enemy fire is less organized but no less deadly, coming from small groups of survivors who are driven by a fanatical desire to destroy the foreign invaders. Captain Miller realizes that the air support has bought them time, but it has not broken the enemy's resolve or their numerical superiority. He checks his map under the red lens of his flashlight, looking for an escape route, a way to slip out of the noose while the enemy is still reeling. But every avenue of approach is blocked by the encircling regiment, and the terrain offers no easy exit. They are trapped in a box of their own making, pinned against the anvil of the jungle by the hammer of the North Vietnamese army. O'Malley crawls over to Miller, his face black with soot, and gestures toward a ravine to the east that was heavily bombed during the last run. He suggests that the cratered terrain might offer a narrow corridor for a breakout, a path so destroyed that the enemy might not expect them to use it. Miller looks at the map, then at the ravine, and nods slowly, realizing it is a suicide run. But staying here is a death sentence. He keys the radio one last time to give the FAC their intentions, preparing to lead his battered team into the unknown darkness of the bombed-out jungle. As the rumble of the A-1 Sky Raiders fades into the distance, a heavy, suffocating silence descends once again upon the ravaged battlefield. The fires started by the napalm have burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows that play tricks on the eyes of the exhausted defenders. For a moment, the only sound is the crackle of cooling wood and the groans of the wounded, a grim interlude that O'Malley knows is merely the calm before the final storm. The NVA, though battered and burned, are still out there in the darkness, and the absence of the aircraft gives them the courage to crawl out of their holes and reform their shattered lines. Then, a new sound drifts down from the cloud layer, a low, steady drone that differs distinctly from the high-pitched whine of the jets or the throaty roar of the Sky Raiders. It is the rhythmic, reassuring hum of twin radial engines, the sound of a World War II-era cargo plane converted into a weapon of mass destruction. Specialist Turner looks up from his radio, a cracked grin splitting his grime-streaked face as he recognizes the engine note of the AC-47 gunship. Call sign, Spooky. This slow-moving giant is the guardian angel of the night, a platform capable of lingering over a target for hours and delivering a continuous stream of fire that no ground force can withstand. Suddenly, the sky above the jungle opens up, and a solid beam of red light stretches from the clouds to the earth like the finger of an angry god. It is a terrifyingly beautiful sight, a continuous stream of tracer ammunition fired from 3 miniguns, each capable of spewing 6,000 rounds per minute. The tracers are spaced 1 for every 5 rounds, creating an optical illusion of a solid laser beam that weaves and undulates as the pilot banks the aircraft. The stream of fire acts like a giant, glowing whip, lashing the jungle floor and searching for the enemy concentrations that surround the beleaguered Green Beret team. The sound that accompanies the visual display is unearthly, a deep, guttural moan often described by the troops as a giant tearing a heavy canvas sheet. It is a continuous roar that vibrates in the chest cavity, a mechanical banshee wail that signals immediate death for anyone caught in the beaten zone. The miniguns chew through the triple canopy jungle as if it were paper, the heavy 7.62mm rounds shredding trees, vegetation, and men with indiscriminate fury. O'Malley watches in awe as entire swathes of the forest simply disintegrate under the hammer of the gunship, turning the NVA staging areas into slaughterhouses. Captain Miller is back on the handset, his voice steady as he coordinates with the spooky pilot, guiding the fire with the precision of a surgeon. He directs the magic circle, a defensive tactic where the gunship flies a tight orbit around the friendly position. Raining lead on everything outside the perimeter wire. The coordination required is immense. A single degree of error by the pilot or a miscalculation by Miller could result in the stream of fire cutting right through the American team. But desperation breeds trust. And Miller walks the fire in until the red stream is churning up the mud less than 50 meters from their foxholes. The psychological impact on the North Vietnamese soldiers is devastating, far exceeding the effect of the conventional airstrikes they faced earlier. There is no taking cover from the spooky. The angle of fire comes from above, plunging down into the trenches and ravines where the enemy tries to hide. The continuous roar of the guns drowns out orders and screams alike, creating a paralyzing wall of noise that breaks the cohesion of the attacking regiment. For the first time all night, the enemy fire slackens significantly. The survivors too terrified to lift their heads or operate their weapons against the fire-breathing dragon circling overhead. Inside the perimeter, Doc Henderson uses the deafening noise cover to move the wounded into a tighter grouping near the center of the command post. He works by the flickering light of the tracers, his movements jerky and hurried as he reinforces bandages and checks tourniquets. The wounded men stare up at the red sky with a mixture of terror and salvation, the reflected light turning their eyes into glowing orbs. Henderson knows that the gunship buys them safety only as long as it has ammunition and fuel. Once it leaves, the darkness will return with a vengeance. O'Malley uses the respite to crawl around the perimeter. Distributing the last meager reserves of ammunition he managed to scavenge from the dead. He hands out magazines with the solemnity of a priest distributing communion, knowing that these few rounds are the only thing standing between his men and a massacre. He checks on Sergeant Rodriguez, who is busy clearing a jam in his captured AK-47, his hands wrapped in bloody rags to protect them from the heat of the weapon. They exchange a grim nod, the silent communication of men who have accepted that they might not see the sunrise. The NVA, realizing their prey is being protected by an aerial shield, attempt to fight back against the aircraft circling in the dark. Green tracers from Heavy 12. 7mm anti-aircraft machine guns race upward from the jungle floor, trying to find the slow-moving transport plane in the gloom. It is a duel of lights, red against green. A deadly fireworks display played out over the black void of the Central Highlands. The spooky pilot shifts his orbit, jinking the aircraft to throw off the enemy aim, while his gunners suppress the anti-aircraft positions with withering bursts of accurate fire. Miller knows that this aerial superiority is temporary, and that they must use this window of opportunity to execute their desperate breakout plan. He signals for the team to prepare to move, pointing toward the ravine to the east that O'Malley had identified earlier. The plan is madness. They will leave the relative safety of their defensive circle and move into the open jungle, hoping the gunship can clear a path for them. It requires perfect timing. They must move while the spooky is suppressing the enemy. But before the plane runs dry and leaves them exposed in the open, Yabam rallies his Montagnard strikers, whispering fiercely in their tribal dialect to steel their nerves for the terrifying run ahead. These indigenous warriors have fought bravely, but the prospect of leaving their dug-in positions to run through the jungle at night goes against every survival instinct they possess. Yibam gestures to the fire dragon in the sky, telling them that the spirits are fighting with them tonight, using the technology of the white men to weave a protective spell. His leadership holds the indigenous element together, preventing the panic that threatens to shatter the fragile coalition. Specialist Turner receives the dreaded bingo ammo call from the gunship pilot, indicating that the aircraft is running low on 7.62mm rounds and will soon have to return to base. They have perhaps 5 minutes of coverage left, a tiny window of time in which to execute a complex maneuver with wounded men in tow. Miller looks at his watch, then at O'Malley, and holds up 5 fingers, his expression grim. The countdown has begun, and every second wasted is a step closer to death for the entire team. The team strips down their gear, leaving behind anything that isn't essential for fighting or survival, lightening their loads for the sprint. Rucksacks containing rations, extra uniforms, and sleeping gear are abandoned in the mud, sliced open or booby-trapped with grenades to prevent them from being used by the enemy. They keep only their weapons, ammunition, water, and the radio, transforming from a reconnaissance patrol into a light infantry raiding force. O'Malley checks the chamber of his car 15 one last time, ensuring a round is seated, and takes a deep breath of the smoke-filled air. Miller keys the handset and asks the pilot for a final burn. A maximum effort suppression run along the eastern vector to clear the ravine. The pilot acknowledges, and the pitch of the Spooky's engines changes as the aircraft banks steeply to line up the shot. The miniguns open up with a roar that seems louder than before, a solid wall of lead that churns the vegetation in the ravine into mulch. The ground shakes under the impact of thousands of rounds, the noise reaching a crescendo that vibrates the very fillings in O'Malley's teeth. As the gunship finishes its run and begins to bank away toward the west, leaving a ringing silence in its wake, Miller stands up in the darkness. He doesn't shout, but his voice carries a command presence that cuts through the fear and exhaustion of the night. "Move out," he orders, stepping over the lip of his foxhole and into the unknown. The team rises as one, a ghostly procession of battered men, and follows him into the smoking, cratered hellscape of the ravine, leaving the safety of their perimeter behind forever. The silence that follows the departure of the AC-47 gunship is not a peaceful quiet, but a heavy, menacing void that presses against the eardrums of the fleeing men. The jungle, momentarily cowed by the mechanical roar of the miniguns, slowly begins to reclaim the night, with the tentative chirping of insects and the rustle of wind in the shattered canopy. Captain Miller leads the column down into the ravine, his boots sliding precariously on the clay slicked by rain and blood, moving with a desperate urgency that trickles down to every man in the line. They are no longer a cohesive fighting unit but a ragged band of survivors, stumbling through a pitch-black obstacle course of bomb craters, fallen timber, and tangled vines that seem to reach out like skeletal hands to snag their equipment. Moving the wounded through this torturous terrain is a logistical nightmare that taxes the strength of the remaining able-bodied soldiers to their breaking point. Doc Henderson and two of the stronger Montagnard strikers struggle with a makeshift litter crafted from ponchos and bamboo poles, carrying a man whose leg is splinted with a rifle stock. Every slip in the mud, every jar against a tree root, sends a jolt of agony through the patient, who bites down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. The team moves at a snail's pace, a painfully slow procession that feels agonizingly vulnerable to the enemy forces that are surely regrouping in the darkness behind them. The ravine itself is a scene of devastation, a scar on the earth where the snake-eye bombs and napalm did their terrible work during the earlier airstrikes. The air here is thick with the lingering stench of ozone, burnt chemicals, and the sickly sweet odor of decaying vegetation accelerated by the heat. They pass the charred remains of NVA positions, stumbling over debris that was once weaponry or human beings, the darkness mercifully hiding the worst of the gore. O'Malley, bringing up the rear, keeps his weapon trained behind them, his neck prickling with the distinct sensation of being hunted by eyes he cannot see. Suddenly, the point man, a Montagnard scout named Wycloo, freezes and raises a hand, signaling a halt with a sharp hiss of breath. Directly in their path, half buried in the debris of a collapsed tunnel entrance, a dazed NVA soldier is pulling himself from the mud. The enemy soldier, likely concussed by the bombing, blinks in the darkness, his hand groping for an AK-47 lying just out of reach on a pile of dirt. There is a suspended moment of recognition, a heartbeat where neither side moves, before the primal instinct for survival kicks in with brutal speed. Before the NVA soldier can scream or reach his weapon, Wycloo lunges forward with the silent lethality of a jungle cat, his commando knife flashing dully in the gloom. The struggle is brief and desperate, a flurry of motion in the mud that ends with a wet, choking sound as the threat is neutralized. There is no glory in this kill, only the grim necessity of silence. A single gunshot now would act as a beacon, drawing the entire NVA regiment down upon their heads like a pack of wolves. The team steps over the body without a word, their faces set in masks of grim determination, leaving the dead to the jungle. As they push deeper into the ravine, the terrain becomes increasingly hostile, forcing them to hack their way through walls of wait-a-minute vines that tear at their uniforms and skin. The thorns are long and curved, designed by nature to hook and hold, turning every meter of advance into a physical battle against the vegetation. O'Malley feels the exhaustion settling into his bones like lead. His legs burning with the accumulation of lactic acid from hours of combat and movement. He stumbles over a root, falling to his knees. And for a second, the temptation to just lie there and let the darkness take him is overwhelming. Captain Miller checks his compass constantly, shielding the luminous dial with his hand, terrified of losing their bearing in the twisting, chaotic geography of the ravine. The map in his pocket is damp with sweat and rain, useless in the dark without a light that he dares not use. He is navigating by instinct and dead reckoning, praying that the ravine leads to the river valley where a helicopter extraction might be possible at dawn. The weight of command is heavier than his ruck. He knows that a wrong turn here means death or capture for every man entrusted to his care. The psychological toll of the night begins to manifest in hallucinations. The exhausted minds of the soldiers projecting their fears onto the shifting shadows. Trees transform into looming giants, and swaying ferns look like crouching enemy soldiers, causing hearts to hammer against ribs in false alarm. Sergeant Rodriguez, suffering from dehydration and the after effects of the adrenaline dump, whispers to O'Malley that he hears voices in the wind. O'Malley grips the sergeant's shoulder, a grounding touch that says, "I'm here," bringing the man back from the edge of panic. Though O'Malley hears the phantom voices too. Behind them, the jungle begins to echo with the sounds of pursuit. Confirming their worst fears, the NVA have found their trail. Faint shouts and the distinct crack of a twig drift down the ravine, carried on the wind like a death knell. The enemy is not moving with the caution of the Americans. They are moving with the speed of vengeance, using flashlights and torches that flicker through the trees like angry fireflies. They know the terrain, and they know the Americans are burdened with wounded. Closing the distance with terrifying speed, Miller realizes they cannot outrun the pursuit carrying the litter, and he makes a hard decision to set up a hasty ambush at a narrow choke point in the ravine. He signals for O'Malley and Rodriguez to deploy the last claymore mine, planting it facing back up the trail they just traveled. It is a desperate rearguard action, a trap designed to buy them a few precious minutes of lead time. They bury the mine in the mud, camouflage the wire, and hurry to catch up with the main body. The clacker gripped tightly in O'Malley's hand, the wire spooling out behind him. They reach a small stream that cuts across the ravine. The water, black and swift, swollen by the recent monsoon rains. Crossing it is a treacherous endeavor. The rocks are slick with algae, and the current is strong enough to knock a tired man off his feet. They form a human chain, linking arms to pass the wounded across the rushing water, the cold shock of the stream stealing the last of their body heat. One of the montagnards loses his footing and is swept downstream for a few yards before grabbing a hanging branch, his gasp for air sounding dangerously loud in the quiet night. Once across, they scramble up the muddy bank, their boots sliding and churning the earth into a slurry that makes climbing almost impossible. They are forced to crawl on hands and knees, clawing at roots and saplings to drag themselves up the slope, mud caking their eyes and filling their mouths. The physical exertion is total. Men are dry heaving from the effort, their bodies empty of fuel but driven forward by the sheer refusal to die. They collapse at the top of the bank, forming a small, ragged perimeter, chests heaving as they try to catch their breath. O'Malley lies prone behind a rotting log, looking back across the stream toward the path they just left, the claymore clacker sweating in his palm. He sees the first bobbing light of an enemy flashlight break through the foliage on the far side of the water, followed by another, and then another. The NVA pointman steps cautiously to the edge of the stream, his beam sweeping the water. Searching for the sign of the American crossing, O'Malley holds his breath, his finger resting on the trigger mechanism, waiting for the main body of the pursuit element to bunch up behind the scout. The enemy soldiers, perhaps sensing that their quarry is close, begin to shout to one another, their voices echoing off the walls of the ravine. They are confident, aggressive, and numerous, moving with the arrogance of the hunter who has cornered the fox. More lights appear, illuminating the crossing point, revealing a squad-sized element gathering at the water's edge to plan their crossing. O'Malley whispers a prayer to a god he hasn't spoken to in years and squeezes the clacker, sending the electrical impulse down the wire to the mine hidden in the mud on the opposite bank. The explosion is deafening in the confined space of the ravine, a flash of orange light that momentarily turns night into day. The claymore shreds the lead element of the pursuit force, sending bodies and water flying into the air in a gruesome spray. Screams of pain replace the shouts of triumph, and the flashlights are extinguished or dropped into the mud. It is a brutal, effective check on the enemy's momentum, a violent message that the Green Berets are still dangerous, still lethal, even in their retreat. But the blast also acts as a dinner bell, alerting every NVA unit in the valley to their exact location. Miller grabs O'Malley by the harness and hauls him up, shouting that it's time to move, that the hornet's nest has been kicked over for the last time. They turn and run, no longer caring about noise, crashing through the brush as the sky to the east begins to turn a bruised, slate grey. Dawn is coming, bringing with it the light that exposes them, but also the potential for air rescue. It is a race against the sun, and the finish line is nowhere in sight. The sun rises over the Central Highlands, not as a savior, but as a blinding spotlight, burning away the protective cloak of darkness that had shielded the team's retreat. A thick, ghostly mist clings to the valley floor, swirling around the knees of the exhausted men as they stumble into a small patch of elephant grass that marks their pickup zone. It is a pitifully small clearing, barely large enough for a single helicopter to hover, surrounded by towering trees that offer perfect cover for the pursuing enemy. O'Malley scans the tree line with gritty, bloodshot eyes, knowing that the NVA are maneuvering right now to turn this open space into a kill sack. Captain Miller pulls the pin on a smoke grenade, the canister hissing violently as it spews a billowing cloud of vibrant purple smoke into the grey morning air. He clutches the radio handset, his voice cracking with desperation as he guides the inbound flight of slick Hueys toward the colourful marker that is now drifting in the wind. The distant thumping of rotor blades reaches their ears, a rhythmic beat that sounds like the heartbeat of a giant, growing louder with every passing second. For the men on the ground, that sound is the most beautiful music in the world, promising a ride home from the gates of hell. Before the transport helicopters can commit to the dangerous landing, a pair of AH-1 Cobra gunships scream overhead. Looking like angry sharks hunting in the mist, they dive on the surrounding jungle, unleashing a torrent of 75-inch rockets that streak into the canopy with terrifying shrieks that echo off the valley walls. The explosions blossom like dirty flowers, shredding the vegetation and suppressing the NVA machine gun teams that are frantically setting up to ambush the extraction. The Cobra's miniguns buzz like giant chainsaws, cutting a protective corridor of steel and noise around the terrified survivors huddled in the center of the grass. The first Huey slick flares out over the clearing, the pilot kicking the tail rotor around to present the open door to the waiting team while the skids hover feet above the uneven ground. The wash from the blades flattens the grass and whips the purple smoke into a blinding vortex, stinging the eyes and filling the lungs with chemical grit. Doc Henderson and the strikers scramble to load the wounded, tossing them onto the diamond plate floor of the cabin with zero regard for gentleness or protocol. It is a scene of controlled panic, men screaming over the turbine whine, driven by the knowledge that they are sitting ducks while on the ground, as the first bird lifts off, heavy with the weight of the casualties. The NVA launch their final, desperate assault to stop the Americans from escaping their trap. Green tracers erupt from the tree line, stitching holes in the thin aluminum skin of the second helicopter as it hovers inches above the mud to pick up the rear guard. O'Malley and Sergeant Rodriguez stand their ground at the edge of the clearing, pouring the last of their ammunition into the jungle to cover the loading of the command element. The door gunners on the Huey open up with their M60s, the brass casings raining down on O'Malley's head like hot, golden coins. The noise is a physical assault, a cacophony of rotor slap, engine whine, and automatic weapons fire that drowns out all rational thought. O'Malley sees a Montagnard striker take a round to the chest just as he reaches the helicopter door, falling back into the grass with a look of surprise on his face. There is no time to go back, no time to grieve. The crew chief grabs the next man by the belt and hauls him aboard. The pilot is screaming over the intercom that he is taking hits and losing power, his voice tight with the fear of crashing a fuel-laden aircraft into a combat zone. Captain Miller grabs O'Malley by the webbing of his harness and physically drags him toward the waiting skid of the rising helicopter. Shouting for him to jump, O'Malley dives into the cargo bay, his boots scrabbling for purchase on the slippery metal floor. As the pilot pulls maximum power to claw for altitude, the Huey shudders and groans, lurching upward just as a mortar round impacts the center of the LZ. Showering the underbelly of the aircraft with mud and shrapnel, they are leaving the earth, but the transition from the ground to the air feels terrifyingly slow, every second stretching into an eternity of vulnerability. As the helicopter banks sharply to gain airspeed, O'Malley sits on the edge of the floor, his legs dangling out over the receding jungle. The cold wind blasts away the sweat and the smell of death, but it cannot wash away the adrenaline that still courses through his veins like poison. He watches the smoke from the airstrikes rising through the canopy, a grim tombstone marking the place where they almost died. The jungle looks peaceful from 2,000 feet, a lush green carpet that hides the bodies of friends and enemies alike, indifferent to the violence it just witnessed. Inside the cabin, the noise of the wind and the engine makes conversation impossible, leaving each man locked in his own private silence. Doc Henderson is slumped against the firewall, his hands still covered in dried blood, staring blankly at the back of the pilot's helmet, his energy completely spent. The Montagnard strikers, usually so stoic and hardened, are shivering uncontrollably, the adrenaline crash hitting them with the force of a physical blow. There are no high fives, no cheers of victory, only the hollow, haunted look of men who have peered into the abyss and managed to crawl back out. The flight back to the Special Forces base at Pleiku takes 30 minutes, but it feels like a lifetime as they transition between two different worlds. They land on the pierced steel planking of the runway, greeted not by a parade, but by the sterile efficiency of waiting ambulances and intelligence officers. As O'Malley steps off the skid, his knees buckle, his legs finally refusing to support the weight of the night's trauma and the heavy ruck. The base is bustling with the mundane activity of the rear echelon men eating breakfast, trucks driving by a surreal contrast to the primitive slaughter they just escaped. In the debriefing room later that afternoon, the survivors sit in silence, nursing mugs of lukewarm coffee that they are too shaky to drink without spilling. The intelligence officer marks the map with grease pencils, tallying the body counts and the estimated strength of the enemy regiment based on their report. They are told they inflicted massive casualties, that the mission was a success in terms of attrition and intelligence gathered. Miller looks at the map, then at the empty chairs where two of his men should be sitting, and knows that the word success has no meaning in this war. The cost of the night is not measured in the neatly typed reports sent to Saigon, but in the fragments of soul left behind in that ravine. Every man in the room has aged 10 years in a single night, carrying invisible scars that will itch long after the shrapnel wounds have healed. They have survived the Green Berets' night of terror, but they know that the jungle is still out there, waiting patiently for their return. For the professional soldier, survival is not an end, but merely a reprieve until the next mission, the next patrol, the next darkness. O'Malley walks out of the Tactical Operations Center and sits on a sandbag wall, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands as the sun begins to set. He watches the new guys, the replacements fresh from the States, walking by with their clean uniforms and eager faces, unaware of what awaits them in the hills. He wants to warn them, to tell them about the shadows and the noise, but he knows there are no words that can explain it. You have to be there, in the dark, with the smell of cordite and the sound of the bugles, to truly understand the beast they are fighting. As night falls again over the Central Highlands, the story of O'Malley, Miller, and the brave Montagnards becomes another whispered legend in the mess halls of Vietnam. It is a testament to the ferocity of the human spirit when backed into a corner, and the unbreakable bond of brotherhood forged in fire. The war will grind on, consuming more men and more mountains. But for those who walked out of that valley, the silence of the night will never be the same again. They are the lucky ones, the ghosts who walked back out of the green hell, carrying the burden of living when others did not. The documentary fades to black, leaving only the sound of a distant helicopter rotor beating against the air, a sound that fades but never truly disappears. It is the heartbeat of the war, a reminder that somewhere out there, in the deep triple canopy, Another team is stepping off a bird and into the unknown. The history books will record the dates and the coordinates. But the true story lives in the eyes of the men who came back. This was the jungle of 1968. And for the Green Berets, the night is never truly over.